So let me very briefly tell you what my credentials are for being here. So I do cryptography. I'm very interested in applied cryptography. I've done a lot of research over the last few years into things like TLS security. So the reason that you're not using RC4 anymore in TLS is because of research that we did at Royal Holloway. I also got involved in the UK smart metering program as a consultant, helping. So one of the great things about the UK smart metering program is that everything got outsourced n times until somebody actually had to do some work. And some of that work ended up on my desk as a consultant to help select cryptographic algorithms and design some of the protocols that were going to be used to connect the whole system together. We were not involved in the sort of high-level threat modeling or risk analysis, but actually very deep down in the technology, choosing algorithms at the end of the day. So that's one of the reasons that I'm here today. I'm not actually going to talk about smart meters at all because I don't have permission to do so. In fact, I was very surprised to hear the speaker from CESG mentioning the issue of overloading of substations, because I thought that was actually a very sensitive piece of information that wasn't for public release. And it's great to see this new era of CSG openness around these kinds of issues. Okay, so every academic's favorite resource for looking up definitions is Wikipedia. And here's the definition of what IoT is from Wikipedia. But actually, the first two speakers have set the scene extremely well for discussing what IoT is, what the opportunity is, and what some of the risks are. The basic message here is that there's a huge diversity in the types of devices that we're going to be connecting together, from microsensors, measuring rainfall, all the way up to large automotive devices driving around on roads. We're going to be seeing connectivity using different communications technologies, from IP down to very lightweight device-to-device infrared protocols. Potentially trillions of dollars, although who really knows? Of course, this is all very hyped up. We don't actually know what the size of the market will be, but people predict that kind of size. And as we've seen in the first two talks, there are all kinds of privacy and security issues here that we need to address. And what I was asked to do today was to talk about cryptography and how cryptography can help. So why do we need cryptography? Well, it's actually one of the best tools that we have for addressing these privacy and security issues. Cryptography, as you've probably all learned in your cryptography class. I hope you've all taken a cryptography class at some point. It's one of the best tools we have for ensuring that information in transit and information at rest actually remains confidential, can only be read by the people who should be able to read it, and also providing assurance about the integrity of information. Information has not been modified. For example, readings from a smart meter, as just one example. And also the origin of data, making sure that we have data origin authenticity. So cryptography is mostly used, or is going to be mostly used in these systems for providing security for communications, or ComSec, and also achieving and managing access control, controlling which devices have access to which data, and also which users can manage which devices. Okay, so it's a great tool for this purpose. But actually, I really want to emphasize, and this is the one key takeaway that I want you to have from this talk, cryptography is not pixie dust. It's not magic security dust that you can just throw around your IoT solution and the job is done. And this actually links very nicely to something I think that Ian said in his first talk, that you can't add security, or in particular cryptography, after the fact. It's something that needs to be considered very early on in the design stage. It's not something you should be trying to retrofit to your device or to your solution. Cryptography is rarely free at the point of use, to use a kind of a politically sensitive term right now with the election tomorrow. Cryptography costs. It costs somebody because we have to think about the cost of deployment, the cost of key management, the cost of usage, and it might look like it's a really cheap thing that you can just throw on top, but it's something you have to really carefully consider. And there are lots and lots of ways you can get it wrong. So cryptography, generally speaking, is not robust against implementation or against the typical software engineer. Okay, there are lots and lots of ways that people can get cryptography wrong when they try to deploy it. And I'm going to illustrate some of those as we go through. Okay, so cryptography is great, but it's certainly not the only thing you need to worry about. Here are some of the technical challenges as I see them. Key management was already highlighted actually in Ian's talk. So there's this concept of a key management lifecycle from birth of your key to the eventual death or revocation of your key. And you have to think about how you're going to handle that entire lifecycle. Okay? And this is going to include all kinds of issues like injecting the keys into devices, being able to communicate to devices to revoke keys or update keys, and so on and so forth. There are many issues around deployment in constrained environments, special purpose algorithms, lightweight communication protocols, and so on. We also have to think about long-term lifetime of these devices that might be fielded for years and years. So we have to think about how we're going to manage updates of algorithms and also updates to protocols that are controlling our communication. Implementation quality. A particular thing here I would highlight is dependence on randomness. So most cryptography that we use these days requires good random sources for the keys, but also for various other elements of the system. And if you don't have good sources of randomness, then all security bets are off at that point. Okay, and I'm going to illustrate some examples of how that can go wrong. So this was actually, reducing dependence on randomness was a key consideration when we were selecting algorithms for the UK smart metering system, to try to get rid as much as possible of the need for random values in the system, because randomness is hard. And then finally, I'll mention very briefly vulnerability to physical attack. But I really want to dig in now to some of these issues in just a little bit more detail in the time that we have. So let's talk first of all about key management. Why do we need key management? Well, cryptographic algorithms and protocols need keys. They need cryptographic keys. You have to say, where are these keys going to come from? A couple of examples just to set the scene here. Think about wireless security for your home router. That probably involves manual provisioning. You have to go into that router and you have to type a key in via the admin interface, okay? Or it may be that on the back of the device is a key value that's already been put in there by the manufacturer. I would recommend that you change that value. But anyway, so here we have the issue that users, generally speaking, are not very good at choosing keys. They will choose something that's like a passphrase, maybe with low entropy, and these will be very infrequently changed. So let's do a quick survey. How many of you, hands up if you have a wireless router at home? Fantastic, you're all using the technology. How many of you changed the password in the last 3 months? Okay, the number is significantly lower, okay? That doesn't mean that your system has been broken, but it gives you an illustration of how manual provisioning and manual management of keys is going to work. At the other extreme, we could look at the way that your browser works and how it handles your SSL TLS connections. I'm assuming you're all familiar with SSL TLS. Is that a reasonable assumption? Some nodding heads, okay. If you don't know what it is, it's the secure system that's used when you buy something on the internet, amongst other things. So in the SSL TLS system, public keys of root authorities are configured in your browser. We're using here a public key infrastructure, and we have a CA ecosystem, and Ian already highlighted some of the issues that can happen when that ecosystem is disrupted by attackers or by poor management practices. And here we have a complex, many-faceted, many-option automated key exchange protocol to establish session keys that we then use for encryption and integrity protection. Okay? And here we're relying on the integrity of the CA ecosystem to make sure that our keys are not compromised as they're established, to make sure that, for example, somebody can't spoof a website. Okay? But this all happens, as far as users are concerned, pretty much automatically in the background without any intervention. All they get is a browser lock and everything is good. Okay? So these are sort of two extremes of how to address the key part of the key management problem. Okay, so in the Internet of Things space, some of the challenges are as follows. The things that we're trying to deal with may not have a user interface that enables us even to manually configure the keys. So for example, it could be a sensor that's sensing traffic on a road, and the sensor is buried in the ground underneath several feet of concrete and tarmac. It makes it rather difficult to update the key by, connecting via USB port, for example. You have to think at the outset as well, if you're going for one of these kinds of manual configuration systems, where is the other end of the communications path? What system are we trying to build here, and how do we get the keys to the other end of the communications path? So this is, in general, not best left to end users. The thing that we're dealing with may not have the capability to run a complex key exchange protocol if we're thinking about a lightweight sensor. Okay? So, okay, we can just use symmetric key crypto. Now we've got to get keys into all the devices. We probably want to have unique keys per device or per end user, or per endpoint, sorry. Having a system-wide key is just asking for trouble. But it's surprisingly commonly done, right? Because it's cheap, it's easy. You put a key in all of your devices as you manufacture them, probably the all-zero key. That's a good key, right? High entropy. And of course, the attacker only has to reverse engineer or break into one device, can identify the key, and then can basically compromise the whole system depending on how the keys are used. Is there a way of ever updating device keys? And how is the mechanism for updating keys secured? Can it be operated remotely? What authentication procedures are applied to that process to control it? Okay? So these are just questions to think about, really, challenges. Even if we have a more complex key exchange protocol in use, the thing may not have a mechanism to update the root keys, okay? The pre-programmed roots of trust for the PKI, essentially. And they may be too dumb to handle standard revocation procedures, or not have enough bandwidth, or not have a mechanism for getting hold of revocation status information about public keys, which is something that Ian also pointed to in his talk. The key thing here, and this also came up in Steve's talk just a few moments ago, about the incentivization of manufacturers to implement robust key lifecycle processes. They may not be incentivized because the regulatory framework may not exist, or because there are no sanctions when something goes badly wrong. And there are countless examples of this kind of situation out there in the wild, where bad crypto solutions get deployed because of whatever, because of bad engineering practices, but also because there isn't the push to make security a priority in these systems. And there really should be. So I think my view is that there's actually a very strong role for regulation in this space. Okay. Very brief mention then of algorithm agility. So algorithms get broken from time to time. For example, RC4 and TLS. Everybody knew it was a bit fishy, but then 2 years ago, we actually came up with attacks against it that were on the verge of practicality. They're getting more practical. Our latest results improve those attacks. So RC4 is going away in TLS, and TLS is designed that you can easily negotiate which cryptographic algorithm you're going to use as part of this complex key negotiation protocol at the start. But if you're dealing with a lightweight device where maybe the crypto is implemented in hardware, then you don't really have the opportunity to change your algorithm over time. So you better choose pretty carefully at the outset. In particular, and stealing some of the thunder of Flavio's talk later, don't design your own algorithm and deploy it. You will get it wrong. You will, because it's a very, very delicate process, designing cryptographic algorithms. Okay. Even harder than algorithm agility is protocol agility. What if there's a protocol flaw discovered? Or what if we want the protocol to do something new that it wasn't doing before? Can the communications protocol or the secure channel protocol itself be modified in flight? Okay. TLS has that capability. There are different versions of TLS, and we can negotiate which version we're using. But securing that negotiation itself is fraught and difficult. Okay, so that is a challenge. Okay, so much for key management. I think it's one of the key things. What about constrained environments that we're going to deal with in Internet of Things? So some of the most interesting applications, like sensing, for example, we're really talking about low-end devices, large numbers of them widely deployed. The chip area that you have is barely enough to perform the basic data processing that you want to do, never mind having a budget for crypto and security functions. So a meaningful crypto in less than 1,000 gates is, well, let's say it's challenging. This is an open research problem in the crypto community. There are people who are trying to design algorithms specifically to meet this kind of target. And it's very hard to make it secure and fast enough and have a low gate area. All those three things at the same time. You can have any two of the three, but getting all three is difficult. If you think, well, it's fine, I'll just use this thing called DTLS, profiling DTLS is not going to get you there. If you think about the DTLS protocol, it's basically a lightweight version of TLS running over UDP, but then you have all of the protocol overhead of the full IP stack. Maybe you can't afford that in your lightweight sensor. So you might need a special purpose protocol for specific application environments. However, it's really dangerous to roll your own algorithms and protocols, right? The research landscape is littered with examples of people getting this wrong, starting with ROT13 and going up from there, okay? So do you all know the ROT13 algorithm? No? Okay. Basically, you take your letters and you shift them by 13 places, right? So it's a very lightweight encryption algorithm. It's also exceedingly insecure. Okay. I want to tell you very little bit about a recent favorite of mine. This is a protocol called PLAID, or PLAD, depending on where you come from. It stands for Protocol for Lightweight Authentication and Identity. And we've done some analysis of it. So it's a contactless card reader authentication protocol, for access control to buildings and for access to services. It was developed by an agency of the Australian government, Centrelink, which is something to do with sort of social security. Nothing to do with technology, but some guys there decided it would be a good idea to design their own protocol and their own system and start using it. It became an Australian national standard. And then for, I would say, commercial and also egotistical reasons, the person behind it tried to fast-track it through the ISO standardization process and turn it into an ISO standard, which means it gets a big stamp saying ISO approved, then more people will start to use it. Okay? So very strong claims were made for Plaid in its marketing materials. Okay, it's only marketing, but that's fair game for me as a cryptographer, right? If they're going to make public statements, that gives me a target. So Plaid is cryptographically stronger, faster, and more private than everything else on the market, was the ... Okay, that's from specification version 8.0. Now, that should already give you a clue there's something funny going on here. Why are they already at version 8? What was wrong with versions 1 to 7? Okay, so actually this was a protocol that was designed by evolution through feedback from cryptographers saying, no, don't do it that way. Then they would try something else, and no, don't do it that way, and so on and so on. And we're actually at I think we're at version 10 now. The ISO draft standard from 2014 talks about strong authentication in a fast, highly secure, and private fashion without the exposure of identifying information or any other information which is useful to an attacker. That's a pretty bold claim right there. So it was a particular emphasis in this design on privacy, for an eavesdropper listening to the communications protocol between the card and the reader, not being able to infer anything about which card was being used, in particular not being able to track users going around a system. In order to achieve this, it used some very unconventional cryptography. Some very strange design decisions were made. And in fact, we used a very nice statistical technique to come up with a tracking attack against the system. And basically what was happening was that the system was using Rsa Public Key Encryption, and each card had a unique Rsa public key. That key was never transmitted, so it was private, right? Because obviously if the key was transmitted, you could just identify the key, and that would uniquely identify the card. So they always avoided sending the public key of the card, but they were sending ciphertexts that were generated under these different Rsa public keys. And the ciphertext is a number between 0 and n, where n is the public key of the card. So if you could get enough samples of the ciphertexts, you could estimate n, the Rsa public key. And this is actually a classical problem in statistical theory, and it's called the German tanks problem. So there's a nice connection with Bletchley Park, because in World War II, the Germans were numbering their tanks consecutively, and the British wanted to know how many tanks did the Germans have. Okay? So what you have is a bunch of samples of, you observe tanks out in the field, number 27, number 693, and from that you work out what's the best statistical estimate of the total number of tanks. Well, that's exactly the same problem as given a bunch of samples of ciphertext, which are numbers between 0 and n, find the value of n, the maximum possible number you could have. So the German tank estimator is the right statistical estimator for attacking this system. Okay? And that's what we did. Okay, so, but that's not the only thing that was wrong. Okay? This was a roll-your-own homegrown protocol. There's the protocol. I don't expect you to understand it, but something was unauthenticated. There was no forward secrecy. They used a legacy public key encryption algorithm. There was some bizarre trial decryption under multiple keys thing, which required non-standard security properties. They used CBC mode with a 0IV. There was non-standard public key encryption. They didn't use standard padding. There was no integrity protection for the payload. They reused the session key over and over again. I mean, I could go on, right? There was literally every single possible cryptographic error you could make, they made. It's going to be fantastic, actually, for teaching classes on cryptography, how not to design a cryptographic protocol. Now, some of you are not laughing here. Some of you are looking at me stony-faced. How dare I attack a company or a protocol in public? Well, sorry, folks. That's what's going to happen to your protocols and designs if you roll your own. Okay? So don't do it. So we need standards. What about implementation quality? Coming to the next topic. I only have to show you this symbol. Some of you recognize this. This is the Heartbleed logo. So Heartbleed was an implementation flaw in the OpenSSL implementation of SSL TLS. About 85% of the world's servers were running the software that was vulnerable to this, and it enabled an attacker to get the server's private key. That's game over for security, okay? Here's a cartoon that explains the attack in 2 slides. I won't do it because we're a bit short of time. But basically, critical vulnerability in software that went undetected for years. Poor implementation quality. We need to do better. What about randomness? Well, we need randomness everywhere in modern cryptographic algorithms and protocols for all kinds of purposes. But randomness generation, robust randomness generation, is actually really hard, even when we have access to all the traditional entropy sources, like keyboard presses or interrupt times, all that kind of thing. It's difficult to get it right. There are lots of classic examples, like the OpenSSL random number generator, like the Linux random number generator, getting it wrong at various points in the past. Much better now, but still difficult to get right. In IoT, you don't have access generally, or you can't guarantee that you'll have access to sources of entropy to seed your RNGs. So the alternative approach is to try to de-randomize as much as possible. And here's an example of what will go wrong in the IoT. Okay? So this is Dilbert visits the accounting department. Over here we have our random number generator. It's some kind of troll. I guess this is Dilbert's idea of an accountant, 999999. That's a perfectly good random number, I guess. Dilbert says, are you sure that's random? And the devil says, that's the problem with randomness, you can never be sure. Okay, so actually there's a serious, I don't know if Scott Adams understands computer science, but there's a serious point here, which is that conformance testing or having test vectors for randomized algorithms is really difficult in general, because they have random inputs which you can't control. Okay, so Dilbert's tour of accounting nonetheless, another example of what can go wrong, so this is some work that we did recently. You can look this up on the internet. Factoring RSA keys for fun and a profit of $9,000. So there was this thing called the Freak attack that came out, which detected that a lot of web servers would cough up 512-bit RSA keys. These were legacy keys that were used to enable export-grade cipher suites back in the 90s, but servers were still using them. So we, about a week after the paper was published by other researchers, we performed an internet-wide scan. So we scanned the whole of IPv4 to find all of the export-grade RSA keys that were being offered by servers. We found 22.7 million hosts that were running SSL TLS, and 9.7% of them offered such keys. This is actually this is good news, because the figure that was reported in the original piece of work was 25%. So it went from 25% down to 10% in about 10 days. So that's progress, right? We actually found that 294 of the hosts, roughly 2 million hosts, had trivially factorable keys. The reason being that they actually shared prime numbers with other keys. Okay, so you have to know a little bit about how RSA works here, but basically there's a very simple attack called a Pairwise Gcd Attack that took 153 seconds to run on our server, and you trivially break 294 of the hosts. You get the private key of the host. Okay? And this was attributable to poor randomness in the key generation phase. I think even more startling, we found that one RSA key was actually repeated 28,394 times on different IPv4 addresses. And it turned out that that was a cheap router with an SSL VPN module attached to it, which basically the manufacturer had either programmed in a fixed RSA key there or had really bad randomness failures during key generation. We don't know which one it is. That key, that single key, could be factored for the cost of about $100 on a commercial cloud computing service. So $100 divided by 28,394 is about 3 cents. So 3 cents to break each of these keys, or to break this, to break each of these devices. And then you would be able to impersonate that device to its users. Okay? So just to show you, and if you want to read more about that, I guess there's a URL there, but it's easier just to search for that, factoring RSA keys for fun and profit. And just go talk very briefly about physical attack now. So these low-cost things that we're talking about here, generally speaking, are going to be badly protected against direct physical attack, okay, where you try to extract keys or software from the devices. I think Flavio will talk about this later. There are also lots of different types of side-channel attacks where you measure the power consumption or the electromagnetic radiation, or you inject faults into the device and see how it behaves that enable you to recover keys and other sensitive information from these devices. There are lots of countermeasures against these classes of attacks, including things like physical shielding, specialized threshold implementations, for example, frequent key changes, although that technique is patented. But this is a very, very active research area, and also there's a great deal of expertise in this area, particularly in the smart card industry. So the likes of Jim Alto, for example, in France, have a lot of expertise in this. And in fact, these kinds of countermeasures are very widely deployed in the financial sector on payment cards, and also in the mobile phone sector on SIM cards. And they're very well understood in those sectors. So I think that the IoT community, such as it is at the moment, could learn a lot about how to protect against physical attacks from that existing expertise in these different sectors. OK, coming to the end. Heterogeneity here is a challenge. We have lots of different kinds of devices, different computational and communication capabilities, and this actually stops you having a one-size-fits-all approach to cryptography. If we could do it, we could just use an SSL TLS-like protocol for all of our secure communications with these devices, and we'd be done. Well, that's a bit simplistic, but that would be great if we could go that far. But we can't, because we have these very low-power, battery-powered devices, for example, which are just not capable of running those kinds of protocols. The challenge here is that, in general, security is best done in a homogeneous fashion. So somebody asked before about, isn't it dangerous to have one standard, where if that standard gets broken, then everything is broken? It's much worse to have a very fragmented and unstandardized space where people are designing their own protocols, which are all broken, and generates a lot of academic research. You don't want that. Okay? I would like that, but you don't want that. Okay, so the challenge is that we have a heterogeneous environment, but security is best done by experts in a homogeneous way. And there's a real tension between those two things. What we could try to do, I think, as in this group, is maybe try to identify some of the different use cases or some of the different characteristics that those use cases have, and think about designing secure algorithms and protocols specifically for those use cases. And then the final closing comment is to say that cryptography can help, but it is not magic pixie dust. So don't blame me when it goes wrong. OK, thank you. Yeah, the question is, are we kidding ourselves that there's actually an Internet of Things where everything will run IPv4 or 6 and be interconnectable, if not actually interconnected? And I think the answer is no. I think we are kidding ourselves. So I agree with the sentiment of your question, because lots of these devices are only going to be running Bluetooth, and then they might connect to some hub, which is then connected to the internet. So the key thing about the internet is that everything should be directly addressable in some sense. Everything should be directly reachable. We really don't want that for the Internet of Things, because that means you have to have a firewall on every single sensor, and that is not going to work. Does that answer your question?
We need a new name then.
Yeah, it's not an internet. Well, no, but actually it's an internet. It's just not the internet. That's the thing. Yeah, the original definition of internet doesn't have the word "the" in front of it. If you look up, yeah, exactly.
One more question.
That's a great question. So just to repeat it, does cryptography naturally have a lifetime, or do individual algorithms have a lifetime? I think they do, but I think we're getting better as a cryptographic community at extending that lifetime and making it pretty long. So if you look at something like AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard, it's now about 10 or 15 years old, and there's been intensive cryptanalysis before the standardization and after, and there's really no serious attack against it of any description at all in that time. And people have tried really hard. And I think that's a good indicator that in the academic, in the open community, we've got quite good at designing certain types of algorithms. Maybe with hash functions, we haven't done quite so well. We're now getting onto SHA-3. Hopefully that design is going to be more robust, but who knows? So yeah, I think designing, so there's actually a debate going on at the moment, for example, in the IETF community about whether we should have one true cipher suite for something like SSL, which is like, fixing your algorithms once and for all, or whether you should allow this kind of diversity and the ability to change algorithms. And there's not a consensus yet emerged on the right way to go. My view is that you should always allow flexibility and have that mechanism, because you never know. You never know what might happen.
So I think we're going to have to say thanks, Kenny, for that.
Okay.
At this point. Thank you very much.